Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this special bonus episode of the INSA Foundation's Future of the IC Workforce Technology and Talent Transformation Series, underwritten by GDIT and ClearanceJobs. This series has explored the challenges and opportunities the intelligence community faces in attracting and retaining a diverse and skilled workforce. In our first episode, we focused on the increasing representation of women and minorities in STEM careers and raising awareness of the many career paths within the IC. The discussions ranged from engaging high school counselors to having government and industry leaders help students connect their academic interest to opportunities in the IC. Our second episode examined how the community has adapted its recruitment and retention strategies to diversify the talent pool. Topics included new pay models to attract students from high demand technical fields, joint duty assignments, and deployment of career development officers to colleges and universities to provide insights into the wide range of national security careers. Across the series, speakers strongly support Harry Coker's skills-based hiring initiative to help close the cyber skills gap. We look forward to hearing more about that today, especially around contract requirements in the US government. As a reminder, all these insightful ideas will be included in a series white paper set to be released later this year. Now, before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have questions, and we hope you do, please submit them through the questions box on the right side of your screen. Our moderator will do her best to get to as many of your questions as possible. We are pleased to welcome members of the press to the program, and this is a reminder that this program is on the record and is being recorded. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator. Lindy Kyzer is the Director of PR and Content at ClearanceJobs, the largest career site and online community for security cleared professionals. A former Department of the Army civilian, she's a strong advocate for improving the pathways into national security careers. Lindy, over to you for moderating today's discussion.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you to the Intelligence National Security Alliance, the Intelligence and National Security Foundation, and GDIT for putting on this entire series. We had outreach to OMB about this topic, and we just could not do this event without their participation. So I so appreciate you guys for joining us. You have been doing so much around federal hiring and improving the federal hiring process. So I think highlighting and spotlighting that effort, because we talked about before even the program started, there's always these kind of monolithic things happening in policy and progress, and it's hard to see it from the outside, but we know it's happening. So our chance to kind of engage and have a conversation and talk about that is really important. So I so appreciate Loren Schulman, Associate Director for the Performance and Personnel Management at OMB, and Stephanie O'Neill, Performance Manager at OMB, for joining us. Thank you so much for being a part of this series and joining us today. Again, we're going to take questions, but I'm going to start out and ask a few. So OPM and OMB released a joint memo on improving the federal hiring process. I just want to kind of talk about that as a framing as we just start, because we know how long that took to get to fruition. You've been working on this for a few years. There's been a few iterations out. Kind of talk about that memo that came out, again, just a few months ago, that process and what to expect. And just a reminder, Stephanie's on camera here. Loren is on audio only, but we will see her lovely photo as she talks. So Loren, I'm going to start with you if you can speak to that a little bit.
Hey, good morning, everybody. It is a delight to be there with you. Speaking of hiring experience or any other kind of government experience, apologies that I cannot be on screen, but I'm very much with you there in spirit. I hope it's a good photo you guys picked. So let me get to the heart of this question. So as you said, we've been working on this. This has been a major priority of the Biden-Harris administration from the beginning. We highlighted strengthening and empowering the federal workforce as the top priority goal of the president's management agenda. It was number one on purpose because the workforce is an absolutely critical component to everything that we do, whether it be the rest of the management agenda or any other policy or strategy we issue in the federal space. We have to have, and this just makes sense, think about it. You have to have the right people. You have to have the people with the right skills. You have to be able to bring them on at the right time and in the right way so that they start that public service career off with that fire in their heart from day one. And with that, we get a much better ability to deliver for the American people in a timely way and in a way that is going to bring about the best possible outcomes and experience. So the first strategy that we identified with the PMA to do that, President's Management Agenda to do that, was to attract and hire the most qualified employees who reflect the diversity of our country. And agencies have been working hard on lots and lots of different aspects of this for a long time. But what we wanted to do with this hiring experience memo was pull together, hey guys, here's the entire toolkit that's available to you. Here's all that we expect of you that is possible to improve in the hiring space. Here's the toolkit that is available to you. And here's the permission and empowerment to make sure that you have access to all of that at your fingertips. And I'll let Stephanie talk through some of the specifics here. But to me, here's why that matters. Because it's not just, well, there's a lot of challenges that people talk about regularly with the federal hiring experience. Some of that is myth, some of that is real. But when people come to public service, when you start out their entire experience with something that is welcoming, with something that makes best use of the scale of the federal the federal government in order to bring on the best possible talent, that recognizes that a hiring experience can be stressful and challenging, and that recognizes that communicating clearly about roles, about expectations, about timing, about titles, about salaries, all of that gets us better outcomes, and all of that gets us better performance from those who bring on board. When you start out with that is what you're trying to work towards, many of the things we identified in the hiring experience memo not only make complete sense, but should have been where we were from the beginning. So I'll turn it over to Stephanie to articulate a little bit more, like, here's what we've been trying to do in that. Stephanie?
Thanks, Loren. I'm excited to be here to talk to you guys about all the great work that we've been doing around the HX and the XX memo in particular. So I think to kind of build on what Loren said, that we did a lot of listening. So what are the real, no kidding challenges, and how do we kind of separate those from some of the myths? But how do we really, push the envelope and make really big improvements? And we did this around 3 populations. So we looked at the applicants because those are obviously essential. We looked at the hiring managers who, some of them hire many, many folks a year, but some of them will only hire two to three folks a year, so that we want to make this an experience for them that they can replicate and do periodically, but they don't necessarily have to be the expert on. And then we also focused on our HR specialists who really do provide that incredible breadth and depth of knowledge to make this process work. So just as an example, applicants often say that job announcements are written in confusing language and don't provide real details about what the job entails. And that I think is borne out just even, through our own federal, those of us who have had our own federal hiring experiences, kind of wondering, but what does the day-to-day look like? And what are the real skills that I need to be successful here? So the memo requires that federal job announcements are written in plain language using available tools to ensure an understanding by job seekers outside of the government that accurately conveys the position and skills sought by the hiring manager and is supported by analysis of the nature of the job. So that when you walk in, you at least have a sense of like what day one should look like. Another frequent issue that comes up among hiring managers is around those self-assessments. So when you go into USA Jobs and you say, yes, I want to apply for this, there are a few questions that you're hit with. And they are not necessarily, people don't necessarily accurately portray how, their level of skill set on that, or they feel kind of forced to rate themselves very highly, so that they can actually ultimately make the list and to be reviewed by a hiring manager. And that's not great for anybody. Nobody feels really good about that process. So what we'd like to do through the memo is supporting the widespread use of those skills-based assessments that were brought up earlier. So not only can you confidently say, yes, I absolutely can do this, you can do your homework and show folks how that worked out. And finally, we heard about this is not news, but challenges around time to hire. And the memo encourages the use of innovative practices such as pooled hiring, to speed up the processes and get the talented people that we need in the jobs as quickly as possible. So there are a lot of pieces where the memo is really supporting getting this done. And I'll toss it back to, but monitoring is a big piece of this. And I'll toss this back to Loren to talk about how we're monitoring implementation.
Yeah, that to me is a critical question, because let's be real, the federal government, federal government and many other institutions, it's really easy for us to put out a policy, a speech, a statement saying like, here's where we're going. It is much harder to work through the implementation. The implementation is a 95% of the effort there. We worked really hard to get these words right, but we did that in a way so that we could hold ourselves accountable to what good looks like when the higher experience memo is implemented. And much of it is already in train, and some of it will be done in the future. So with that in mind, something that there are many elements to this, but something we're committed to do every quarter is to track where are agencies in terms of their implementation of this memo. What are the results that they are finding? Are they actually using the tools that are available to them? Is that having the impact we anticipated, for better or for worse? And how can we adjust over time? When I say, and I should explain, the President's Management Council is the deputy secretaries or chief operating officers from all the big agencies getting together they get together every month, and in this case, they'll get together every quarter to talk through, are we actually doing what we intended to do? Not just with the words on the page, but with the reality on the ground. Because if we're not, we need to adjust and set a better course. If we are, we need to continue to spread those practices. So it's not just a memo, it's lots of demos, it's lots of practice, it's lots of permission to be able to do the work that we set out in the policy, so that it becomes something that is a totally normal, expected norm across all of our federal hiring experience. That was a lot, but Lindsay, I'll hand it back to you to dig in further.
You can't give me too much context, so I love the back and forth. You're cueing to each other, so it's perfect. I barely have to moderate this session. This is fantastic. But we had a question come in from Jason Briefel asking about the status of Trusted Workforce 2.0. That actually tied into my next question, which is, so I'm glad he asked it, so it's not just me being the wonky security nerd. But anytime I hear talk about human capital, when we're talking about future of the national security workforce, that personnel vetting piece of it, you can't unnest that from it, because you have suitability, credentialing, security, you're going to somehow be nested in that process. So how is what you're doing from candidate experience tie into also what's happening with trusted workforce or personnel vetting reform? And is there a understanding across human capital that those two things have to work together? I'll start with you, Loren, I think.
Yeah, great question. So first, just let me say, like at the top, the people who are the leaders and the drivers behind the Higher Experience Initiative are some of the same. There's a bigger team that are part of the broader Trusted Workforce 2.0 implementation work that we've been doing over the course of this administration, that of course has been in multi-administration conversation around security clearance reform. So just at the top, I'll just note that this is very much intersected with and an outgrowth of the President's management agenda. Trusted Workforce 2.0 is an initiative that aims at government-wide reform in modernizing the security clearance process, the continuous vetting of individuals who have access to sensitive information. And that ranges from those who are in the intelligence community at the highest levels of security classification and access, all the way to folks who are coming in and just need a lower level of public trust or otherwise clearance in order to perform their job and get access to information. Continuous vetting capability replaces the investigations that many of us who've been around for a while have been familiar with in the past, which traditionally occurred every 5 to 10 years. And one of the key metrics that our friends in this community at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence track is the average time to complete. The full implementation of that Trusted Workforce 2.0 initiative the full implementation of Trusted Workforce 2.0 is meant to go through 2026. And we've been super encouraged by progress we've seen so far, while recognizing that like there's always things that pop up and challenges for us to face there. The question is asked of like, how do these intersect? Do we all see these as part of the same package? 100%. hiring does not end when we hand over that hiring package over into that security process. And we are continuing to give close attention to the end-to-end personal vetting process, the time that it takes to do that, the average time it takes to complete an initiation of investigation for any vetting scenario, and the average time that it takes to make a trust determination based on a completed investigation for a vetting scenario. And that has actually a good intersection with how we think about time to hire. It would be easy to talk about time to hire just in the moment I put my application in to the moment that I come on board. And like that is an important metric, don't get me wrong. But what's really important is to look at the component pieces of that so that we can understand where is it we're facing barriers? Where are we slowing down? How can we either apply better policy, better resources, better permission, or better connectivity across those elements so that we can address whatever is either slowing us down or maybe better and more appropriately define for candidates, here's why some parts of this slow us down, or here's what's going on in this moment. So yes, it's taking a while, but we want to be transparent with you about what's happening and why, as you can understand where you are in that particular situation. So they are absolutely part of that same story. There's also some component elements to them in terms of how we learn from this. One big picture element that is critical across the entire hiring system is that we be transparent with candidates about what it's going to take, the time required, and then very importantly, why some of these things are required so that they understand where they fit into that overall narrative.
No, I love that because there was actually a CNAS study about the federal hiring process, and what it said was candidates were willing to wait it out if they just knew how long. Or you can find gap employment if you know, hey, this onboarding process will probably take 6 months or 12 months. But the hesitancy was like, well, if I don't know, then they lean towards a no because they're just taking a chance on that, on that open end. So anything we can do to create those benchmarks and create a little bit more predictability in what can be an unpredictable hiring process is fantastic. So Stephanie, do you have any thoughts on that intersection of trusted workforce, personnel vetting, and the security and what you're doing with OMB hiring?
Absolutely. I think it's really important for agencies to understand that they have some responsibility in making sure that the clearance level is at the right level. We're not over expanding what clearance level needs to be just to make sure that's efficient. And they also have some flexibilities around, okay, so what around interim clearances in some cases. We have to be just judicious about those. We certainly don't want to overuse that option. Use it where it's fruitful and useful and appropriate. But it is an option for a number of positions. There is work that can be done to kind of move things along and get those spots filled so that we don't burn out our employees. And that kind of brings me back to a point that Loren brought up around transparency and communication. And not only make sure that we get the right folks in the seats, but that actually has implications for the longer term in that how am I engaged as an employee? Do I believe in this mission and understand what I can contribute to it? And that really starts at these first stages of in-processing and onboarding and throughout the hiring experience.
I love that you mentioned like right sizing, what clearance levels we're at. I've actually, Matt Eanes, who we both know with PAC email, has forced me over the past 6 months to reinvent my entire vernacular and talk about personnel vetting versus security clearance. Not everything is security clearances. We're moving continuous vetting into the non-sensitive public trust. I think it's going to be more important that we understand the vetting process and what that puts you into, because that's a much bigger piece of the population than security clearance. But they are a part of this ecosystem. They are a trusted worker. They are a part of all of these things that we're talking about. Even it's not just the special sauce security clearance. Personnel vetting is special too. I'm learning to embrace that. So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about skills-based hiring. That's been a big push. John mentioned at the beginning of the conversation. So I kind of want to pivot to you, Loren, and talk a little bit about OMB's role and responsibilities in executing that National Cybersecurity Strategy Implementation Plan. And that pillar of the resilient future and promoting skills-based hiring across the cyber workforce.
Love talking about skills-based hiring. And the first thing I want to say, actually, before I get into specifics on OMB's role, is that skills-based hiring is a lot of things. It is not like one monolithic, like we put the stamp skills-based hiring on something and then it becomes an end-to-end element. There are pieces of this that agencies are doing already today and have for a very long time. Actually, the astronaut program is a skills-based hiring initiative where they are bringing in folks to use assessments in order to do skills-based hiring, and that actually exists in so many different spaces too. So skills-based hiring is not just the future, it is a thing that we've been executing really competently and innovatively across the federal space. But on this question around the cybersecurity implementation plan, this is a place where it is so important for us to innovate, to get this right, and to bring different elements of this in across the federal space. We as the Office of Management and Budget, have been fully engaged with our good friends at the Office of the National Cyber Director and the Office of Personnel Management as co-chairs around this initiative of the investing in a resilient future that calls for skills-based hiring practices in the cyber workforce. The work that we're doing is meant to ensure that skills-based hiring is a robust feature at agencies' hiring initiatives. And what it is meant to do is allow agencies to move away from using degree attainment as a proxy measure for skills. Here's why that's important. So let's say I have a degree in classical studies, which is actually my minor. It's entirely possible for me to have a degree in classical studies and be able to nerd out and speak ancient Greek, which is fun, but not necessarily the most useful skill, while also having in any number of experiences built up a ton of incredibly great technical skills in cybersecurity and IT and artificial intelligence and otherwise. That's not going to show up in my degree in classical studies. If we develop and make more robust our skills-based hiring, we would be able to much more easily screen applicants for the skills and experiences they bring to the table and not just what they have on their resume in terms of their degree. That allows us to use assessments to determine what an applicant's skill set is and to much more objectively measure the ability to perform the duties of a position, not just what degree they have, not just what was the title that you had at a prior organization, but looking at an assessment of their hard skills or soft skills, terrible terms, of their specific skills so that we know better where that they fit into the federal ecosystem. And our friends at Office of Personnel Management are actually doing some amazing work around this for broader adoption of skills-based hiring practices in what we call, many of you know this, the 2210, the IT management series, which is the huge number of that cuts across a huge number of IT professions. And we should see the fruits of that effort in the coming months. But as I said at the beginning, there's so much of this that is already sprinkled across the federal hiring system that we are gaining the benefit of overall. Different pilots that have occurred, different innovations across different agencies, ways that agencies have developed or procured their own assessments, or ways they brought in skills-based hiring throughout the process, whether that be in using subject matter experts to evaluate resumes or to do structured interviews or to help design online assessments as a pre-screen. There's lots of cool innovation on this.
Yeah, and I talked about the metrics around this too a little bit. I know you talked about that with your joint memo. I think it applies to the cybersecurity skills-based initiative. How is OMB kind of uniquely positioned to ensure agencies are tracking and actually taking advantage of skills-based hiring? Stephanie, can you speak to that?
Absolutely. So as a part of the launch of the memo, we pushed out and developed in partnership with OPM, who really worked with agencies to develop a set of kind of firm metrics, a set that assessed kind of all of the different specific initiatives that we're trying to, or at least a handful of the specific initiatives that we're trying to move forward. But we realized that this is an iterative process. So while we started off strong with a good set of metrics that we really feel like captures a lot of the initiatives we're trying to move forward today, we realized that as we complete, or as we complete's really the wrong word, but kind of achieve the level that we want to, as we're successful, we need to start moving there and turning our eyes to new things. And skills-based hiring is absolutely on our target list as we evolve that set of metrics. So I think OMB is in a great position to really kind of lead the charge and push that kind of higher and deeper levels of analysis to make sure that our leaders have the information that they need timely, in order to make those right decisions and how to help build their workforces using strategic workforce analysis, and measures on the adoption rate of skills-based hiring is among those.
Awesome. And just a reminder, I see questions coming in, so continue to drop your questions in the chat. If we don't get to all of them today, it gives me follow-on ideas for other content that we can push out and questions that I can ask later, but continue to drop your questions in. I did want to do one question, and it specifically ties into like skills-based hiring. So how does all of this or any of this apply to the contractor community? So, you know, I know there's been this major push just for skills-based hiring, but we have this huge segment of people who are supporting the government in that trusted workforce in the federal population that may be working in contractor positions. Is there the push in policy to update those contracting regulations so that contractors can also apply skills-based hiring as they are hiring for their positions? Loren or Stephanie, do you have thoughts there?
Yes. So I will give a short answer with you should definitely talk to our friends in other parts of the federal space to dive into this more. So just stepping back, it is incredibly important as we talk about these hiring and personnel reforms that we think about how the work that we do in the federal space should or could intersect with the incredible contractor community as a part of the broader federal ecosystem, and in particular part of the broader national security ecosystem. So I think that, one, the answer is there's a lot of dialogue going on about this today, and there in different the acquisition policies and regulations. And you should definitely talk to our friends in terms of how they're thinking through this. And in many ways, actually, this is a space where has the potential to be like as much or more innovation and places that we can like learn from one another, so that our friends, the contracting community, are testing things out that we're able to bring in the federal space or vice versa. One thing that in the same way that we have to get away from the practice of using degrees as a proxy in federal hiring, just because it feels like that's the way we always do it. We are looking very hard at, or our friends in other spaces are looking very hard at, how do we make sure that we are not building that in as an assumption when we develop contract vehicles? Because it would be, the easy button might be like, oh, well, please hire X number of humans with master's in computer science degrees, when actually we would get the same or possibly even better or more, but even significantly better outcomes or have more flexibility if you were talking about bringing on individuals who had X number of skills or X kinds of skills in the contractor community, rather than just relying on degrees as a proxy. So bottom line, yes, great conversation, fantastic opportunity for us to learn from one another. And I know it's an issue that our friends in the procurement and contract space are working through, and highly recommend it as a future webinar option for you guys to build back on.
Acquisitions, we're coming for you. So yes, thank you. We'd love to have that conversation. So we'll follow on with that. I'm kind of talking about also to the intro that John gave, how important skills-based hiring is to attracting more diverse workforce from across the country, which we've talked about. We don't just want to be recruiting for the DMV in the DMV. Can you speak to maybe community colleges, technical programs, how your work is reaching out to those communities and how that might help us attract a more diverse workforce? Stephanie, do you have thoughts there?
Absolutely. You know, community colleges are really the pillar of our efforts to engage with underrepresented communities and to enable them to get the training they need to have a successful federal career. They're really just an amazing gateway. And they're especially attractive in this space because they're accessible and more affordable than most four-year colleges and universities. And this increased access and affordability will really serve to widen the hiring pool so that everyone has the opportunity to engage in federal service. And agencies really have access to top talent. I also kind of here, I want to pull in a plug for federal apprenticeships, for federal registered apprenticeships. So there was an executive order that came out several months ago around federal registered apprenticeships and building that base in the federal government, but also hiring completers. So finding those intersections and those ways to pull from underrepresented communities as far and wide as we can is really essential. And we're really excited about the impacts of that work.
Yeah, shout out Department of Army intern graduate here. So I'm a huge fan of the government internship programs and apprenticeships. Somebody who's starting out in federal government. And I always say those are a diverse age range. It's just somebody who might be new to federal service. Look into the internships and apprenticeship opportunities because they are a fantastic way to get launched into federal service. I love that program and I always advocate for those. So I want to talk about, I love OMB because you're like, I joke with Jason Miller, he's like the man behind the magic curtain. I don't know if he likes that argument, but he said it's kind of true. You're behind the scenes in a lot of this, doing policy process work, but impacting the entire federal ecosystem with the work that you do. So can you kind of speak to what the response has been from some of the agencies, the people you interact with as you're kind of pushing out some of this and helping to kind of, change the way the federal government is operating? Loren, can you kind of speak to OMB's role in that and some of the response that you've gotten?
This is a great question. So I mentioned this a bit earlier where one thing that the federal government is good at is, well, I say good at, they should be good at is writing memos, writing policies, writing regulations. And we worked really hard on the hiring experience memorandums to make sure that we were not just writing for lofty policy, but for specific implementation expectations, toolkits, and how we're going to hold ourselves accountable. And what that means is that as we are putting this together, we're working with a huge number of communities to talk about what this memorandum should mean from them. And those conversations didn't just wait for the launch of the memorandum, but like importantly, with the things that we've done since August are, one, work with our friends at the Office of Personnel Management and elsewhere to hold a lot of different webinars, trainings, info sessions around here's how you as a hiring manager, or here's how you as an HR specialist, or you as a human capital data champion should be thinking through what this memorandum means for you. Are you using these specific tools? Do you have access to the systems like the agency talent portal that this is meant to offer? Are you finding the same kind of results that you would expect that we have anticipated in implementing these tools? And if you're not, let's share that feedback on that. And so that's been a continuous part of this implementation process of not just like talking to audiences like all of you, though you are wonderful to talk to you, but also talking to those who are implementing on the ground, not just at the CXO council level, but at the implementer level across the country to make sure that this makes sense to them. Because this was not just for us here in Washington. This was not just for us here at the PMC. This was to make sure that all of the innovations that we think that we put in place are trickling down and being utilized and implemented in the way that we would have anticipated. And if they're not, we want to bury your bust for you immediately to figure out why not. And if they are, and you're doing even cooler things with it, we want to find ways to spread those throughout the federal ecosystem. It was also important for us this be a thing that was not just seen as like, oh gosh, one more thing to do, one more innovation for us to implement when we have all these other things that are going on. So we tried to take the best of what we heard from agencies of what they were doing and spreading promising practices so that they could brag and show off and teach one another about what works. OMB and OPM, Office of Management and Budget, and Office of Personnel Management, they can be conveners. They can lift up what good looks like. They can showcase that across not only policies, but also across the federal budget process and federal performance process. But the folks who are doing the work across the agencies, across the country, at every possible level, they're the ones who are making this real. And we want to be able to lift them up as incredible teachers and incredible innovators, and the way that we end up getting to good and getting to change management in this space. Last thing I'll say is as an employer, we really, really care about making sure that we have the right talent and the right roles and ensuring our employees have a career path that meets their professional goals. That's where this starts out for us. And that's going to be different in different ways for everyone across the board. So there's no one size fits all of what this memo ends up looking like. But that's why our intention to track metrics around like where this is going is so critical for us to having this not be a one-time thing that we release, but rather a resource that we highlight over and over again and to continue to build on over the next several years.
Yeah, I love that. I think one of my favorite things about the Trusted Workforce Initiative has been the quarterly updates that have come out of the PAC PMO, just saying like, hey, we're getting steady update metrics coming out, things like that. The data geek in me, I pretend to be a data geek. I actually make up numbers for things. But I find that fascinating and so important to what's going on here. So I had a question, it's very specific, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it directly though, because I think it's pretty important. So talk about, when will the administration release its legislative proposal to update and professionalize the federal HR workforce that's included in the president's budget? That ties into just, I think it's so important to professionalize the federal HR workforce. So can you speak, or either of you provide an update on that?
So I can talk to that generally. That is the legislative proposal of my friends at the Office of Personnel Management. So I don't want to speak to that, but let me talk about for a minute why that is important. And then I think, again, we should both get back on that, but also I think it's something that we should work on with OPM to continue this conversation. So the federal HR workforce, they are, to me, I think the front line of helping make sure that we have an incredibly strong public and civil service in the federal ecosystem. They are the ones who are recruiting. They're the ones who are helping folks through that what can be often a long and hopefully increasingly transparent, but sometimes opaque hiring process. They're the ones that greet you on your first day. They're the ones that are making sure that you are having a career path that makes sense for you. And they're the ones who are creating that first employee experience as a public servant. So their role is so critical to that. And one of the things that was important to us as we pulled together this memo is making sure that they had a toolkit that best represented all of the good innovations we've done over the past several years, that takes the best advantage of the scale of federal hiring, whether by access to data, access to candidates across the federal ecosystem, or access to shared and promising practices that should not just be buried within one agency, but should be shared elsewhere. There are our friends at Office of Personnel Management have been, as a part of the process of the past several years, doing a number of initiatives to strengthen that HR workforce, whether that comes to training, whether that comes to professionalization and certification, whether that comes to sharing what good looks like across the Chief Human Capital Officer Council and otherwise. And this proposal is meant to not be the only step in that, but be one of the critical ones that opens up some of that there. So I will tell you that it is real and it is coming and it is going to be possible, but it's also something that I have to let my friends at OPM speak to there. So more to follow, but I'm so glad that there are people who care about this, because it is such a critical element to the work that we want to do now and over time. It is also not the only thing. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes and in the front of house in terms of strengthening the HR workforce.
No, I love that. And I think it comes down to kind of how sometimes these functions are bucketed. I think human resources can seem just like a support function, but not the mission. So I think anytime we can highlight it as a part of the mission, like this is a mission critical function. This is not just a back end support function. There's critical work being done. So I know that was another question that we had, kind of talk about the skills-based hiring. How does that change the requirements for training or even upskilling within the federal workforce? So can you kind of even talk about upskilling skills across the federal workforce a little bit? Stephanie, could you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think it's important to point out the first off that once you get the job, it's not a one and done. Like, professional learning and professional development is something that every employee has to engage in, regardless of their professional background or their career aspirations throughout their career. I think this is, especially intense and something that we talk about a lot in IT, but I think a lot of what we're trying to do with the HX memo is even support our HR partners to say, hey, look, here's a set of trainings that you can engage on so that you can implement what we're asking you to do in the memo. And so I think the federal government has been a great proponent of professional learning. I know I myself have, over my 12-year federal career, have really benefited from all of the learning and development opportunities that have been provided to me. And I think it's both incumbent on agencies to provide those avenues and for hiring, for supervisors to work with their employees to say, hey, where do you want to be in 5 years? How are we going to get you there? How do we make sure that you have the skills to be successful in your job, both today and tomorrow, and to meet your future goals? But it's also incumbent on employees to say, hey, supervisor, this is something that I want to do in a place that I want to go, and I found this great opportunity, and let's figure out how we're going to fund this. And so I think there are multiple pieces going on. But specifically to the HX memo, I want to elevate what OPM's HX hiring experience team is doing. So they have this whole suite of trainings out there. They through Eventbrite, and they are pushing more trainings out every week. So I encourage those who are interested, both from either a hiring manager or as an HR professional, to go and take a look and see what's out there, to check back regularly, because even those kinds of trainings are an important opportunity for growth.
Awesome. Before the call started, we talked about ClearanceJobs having a Connect event with human capital folks on Thursday. And one of the questions I'm going to ask our friend Sina Begley on a panel that she's on is about the frozen middle, as it were. So we have a question that came in about kind of talking about that. How much of this is policy and how much of this is cultural shift? So I know that's one of those broad existential questions, but those are my favorites. So I'm going to make you answer it if you can. But how much of that is culture, and how do you change that embedded culture within all of these agencies to say, hey, we are going to do hiring different? How do you push that out, right? You push out a policy. How do you enact the cultural change?
Yep. So this is related to many of the things I've been saying here about how we wrote this memo with the intention that it is an implementable memo, but also an implemented memo. And I love this question about, like, is this policy or is this cultural change? Because to me, if you are writing policy that is not intended as cultural change, then you're writing a really limited policy. Because there's any number of things that we in the federal space have existing policy out there for, things like thou shalt or thou can, but are not necessarily implemented or practiced on a regular basis because that cultural change was not prioritized with it. I had a fun thread on LinkedIn the other day that some of you probably saw, is talking about what government change management looks like, because it's not just policy, and actually policy is just like the smallest part of this. What has to be associated with it is pilots, which is one of the areas that fed into this hiring experience memo, using the subject matter expert qualification assessment process, using structured resume reviews, some of the work that was done around agency talent portals or data management. Many of those were pilots that we made best use of in order to understand what works here. In addition to that comes with not only setting policy, but also making sure that people have embedded into their thought process that this is not just policy, but this is permission. It's not just that it is possible to do, but you are allowed to pursue some of these innovations, and that it is the expectation that these innovations are not just a possible thing that you could do, but are the norm. And that is a key cultural change element. And not in addition to that becoming that permission set around the norm, there's also, does it become part of your planning? Are you expecting this not only to do this once, but to do this repeatedly? And are you expecting to resource it? Are you expecting to staff it? Are you expecting it to be something that you keep track of and understand? Are you holding yourself to an overall set of metrics? And then to build on my list of P's here in terms of pilot, policy, permission, and practice and planning, does it become par for the course? Does it become something that is not just a thing that we wrote in a memo that one time that seemed like a cool idea, but that it's become such a norm for you, has become such par for the course, that it doesn't even necessarily, you don't necessarily think about like, oh, this came from the hiring experience memo, but rather this is just part of my day-to-day work as a hiring manager, as an HR professional, or as somebody who is a key part of that ecosystem today. These are the things that we have tried to build in terms of the implementation activities, in terms of training, in terms of delivery of tools, in terms of taking a product management approach to some of these tool deliveries, so that we aren't just setting out the words, but we're thinking through that entire ecosystem of not just cultural change, but of acceptance and absorption into the federal ecosystem.
Yeah, I love that. I love that thread. I think I and several other people also added patience and perseverance. And I think that might be always part of the federal job application process as well, but it's also part of a lot of commercial career opportunities too. I think we don't always talk about that. Like if you want to work, if you have a company that in mind that you want to work for, sometimes it can take months to years to be culturally ready for that environment as well. So the federal workplace is unique, but not the only place that sometimes you have to be patient and persevere.
To on that, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
To build on that a little bit, I think what's exciting about this opportunity now is that we really do have our support from leadership. So they're saying, hey team, let's get this done. And they're sending those right kinds of messages. And in addition to that, we're supplying the support, right? So there's the accountability at the higher level and the measurement that makes sure what gets measured gets done. So there's a little bit of that as well. But there's the training and support as well. So it's expectation, but with kind of that nurturing growth and development that we feel confident they'll pick up over time.
I also love on that leadership point, Stephanie, that to me, this is not the only measure of success, but what I often find is like when you find senior leaders feeling comfortable talking about technical elements of implementation, sometimes that's a bad sign. Sometimes that means that they've had to intervene in a way that is not necessarily healthy. But sometimes it means that they have taken it on board as something that is incredibly important to them and that they care deeply about innovating. And when I listen to the deputy secretaries, the chief operating officers, the chief human capital officers, and others talk with great familiarity around the hiring process, around innovations in the hiring process, and around barrier busting, what good looks like, the importance of plain language, the importance of clear communication, of using data, of having trackers internally, and making best use of the scale of the federal workforce through the agency talent portal. Those are all things that I've heard senior leaders across the federal space talk about with like great familiarity, in a way that it isn't just this innovation is isolated to them, but that they are making all possible effort to make sure that they are finding resources and finding support and barrier busting for those innovations within their agencies. And it's not the only thing that makes me smile about this, but it's one of those things that makes me realize this is actually something that could stick around. These are actually things that will stick around far after this memo is forgotten and the number that's forgotten, far after my tenure here.
Now, I love that, Loren. It points to kind of what you said at the beginning or earlier about the intersection of culture and policy around this. I'm a big believer of if the only people know about what you're doing is a policy or a policy number, or if they're quoting an executive order back at you, probably this hasn't been institutionalized enough, right? Because what they should be talking about is what it does, not, line item, point AB, US code, whatever. Like we want this to be across the workforce because I can't remember all of those wonky policies, and nor can, the human capital ecosystem, across the space. So we had a question. I like it, so I'm going to ask it, even though it's probably a little bit OPM. So forgive me. You can tell OPM to respond later. But to talk about pooling for hiring, because I think this is big when we're talking about kind of the lattice approach versus ladders. People are cross-sectioning across agencies. There been talk or more effort around pooling for job applications versus just I'm applying for XYZ agency in this position. How do we pool our labor and job categories better?
Wow. Okay. There's so many elements to this, and then I'm going to I'll try to jump on a few, and then I'll turn to Stephanie for some specifics. So this is exactly what I'm talking about when I say we need to make best use of the scale of the federal hiring system. We hire 200,000 people a year. That's a lot of people into the federal system. And that doesn't even count people who are moving across agencies or moving within agencies. There's a lot of people that we bring in. And there's a lot of roles that we hire for across the federal system that are very similar. Our mission critical occupations or mission support functions that we hire for across government, whether that be human resources or grants management or procurement specialists or IT specialists, we hire thousands and thousands of those every year. And yes, every agency and every hiring manager wants to think that their version of that is very special and very unique. And it is. However, it does beg the question of why can't we use the fact that we are hiring thousands of roles per year to save everyone time in working through that process? Because if we treat every single hire in the federal government as incredibly unique and incredibly special, this is going to take a huge amount of time. And it's probably also going to burn out both our applicants as well as all the people who work in this process. But if we imagine a system where either and this happens today, where OPM can put out a hiring opportunity that any agency could hire from for an IT specialist, or where, for example, the State Department can say, hey, we are hiring for foreign affairs specialists, and we know that lots of other agencies want to hire for that. Does anyone else want to get access to our cert when we're done with it? Here you go. That means that agencies have saved a huge amount of time and a lot of steps in that process. And in addition to that, and this is my favorite, there's a lot of folks who want to work in government and would be thrilled to work at the Department of the Interior or the Department of Transportation or the Department of Homeland Security. And they would love the opportunity to apply once and get access to many jobs, which is what that pooled hiring experience is meant to offer, so that an applicant can apply once and get access to a lot of jobs, where an agency can take advantage of the work of another agency or OPM and say, oh, wow, you guys have gotten 1,000 qualified applicants who are on the cert. Sign me up. I'm going to hire 20 of those. That means that we've saved each other time. It also means that we've created a better hiring experience for those who are interested. It means that we have saved burden on people who would otherwise not have been able to work through that hiring, that applicant experience. And it also means we have the opportunity to do cool things like create cohorts where you're going to bring on a few hundred IT specialists at one time, or create hiring fairs or interview fairs where people can do a whole bunch of interviews all at one time rather than wait for like lots of opportunities. There's so much to be excited about in that cold space and making best use of the scale. And it's one of those areas where culture is going to be such an important piece of this, and overcoming that, no, but mine is really special and I can't do it that way. There's opportunity for specialization within that cold hiring system. And there's going to be so much promise and time saving and barrier busting that can be associated with that. It's one of the things that I'm most excited about in the hiring experience memo to lift up, in addition to skills-based hiring. And it's going to take the effort of everybody to say it's worth us trying something that feels a little uncomfortable.
Stephanie, did you have any thoughts on that too?
I get really jazzed about metrics. So when there's a connection, I'm like, oh, we can talk about numbers. I'm such a nerd, but I love it. So the pooled hiring initiative is so key to what we're trying to do with the HX memo. That are two metrics that are really aimed at HR professionals are really geared towards assessing how we're really picking that up over time. So the first metric that we're using is the number of pooled hiring actions where multiple agencies make a selection. So those are those OPM, those OPM and agency-driven actions that we're trying to work towards to really make sure that we're being efficient and effective as we can. The second metric that we're assessing is the selection to action ratio, and so that's how many folks did you hire off of the single cert list or a single HR hiring action. And so the more that we can drive those two numbers, I think the more impact we'll see that pooled hiring, the faster the process will go. And, we'll all live in a delightful universe with rainbows and unicorns. And I'm just really excited about this.
Hey, I believe in a delightful universe of rainbows and unicorns. So I'm a hopeless optimist. I love this conversation. I love that I get to interact with people who are passionate about federal hiring, including both of you. So I so appreciate your taking the time to chat with me. I'm going to tee you one last closing question before we wrap up. Just kind of want to speak to, we're heading into, I have to say it, an election season, all of that, all the turnover and crossover with all of that. I feel momentum for what we're doing with federal hiring, right? Skills-based hiring, the folks are talking about this now. How do we continue or carry that momentum across? Why I love working with INSA is they hold all of those ecosystems, right? Academia, industry, federal government, national security, the broader federal ecosystem. Again, it's a totally open-ended question, so you can basically just tell me whatever you want, but how do we continue to stay energized about these efforts over the next 6 months?
So, great question. I love this. So let me give it a shot. And my first thing I want to say is that it's incredibly important for everyone in the federal ecosystem, starting with the folks within federal agencies, but also more broadly than that, that we feel accountable and responsible for the talent that goes into our civil service and our broader federal ecosystem. And that it doesn't just become the job of like, oh, that's HR's role. HR is incredibly important to that. I'm not saying that to undersell. I'm saying that to oversell their importance, to make sure that to lift up their importance, to make sure that they are able to spend time on the work where their work matters most. In addition to that, folks who are hiring managers or who are colleagues or partners or otherwise in the federal ecosystem they should be talent spotting, they should be advocating for these innovations, they should feel it is part of their role as a public servant to continue to grow the community that they're in, whether that be IT specialists or intelligence analysts or cyber or policy analysts or otherwise. They have a responsibility to own that and to be able to see it stay healthy, to get healthier, to grow, to innovate, or otherwise. If we change the conversation from like, oh, hiring is a thing that happens over there that somebody else does in a silo, to this is something where building that federal community is everyone's role and wanting to be a part of it and excited to innovate within it. That means that that conversation doesn't end a few months after a memo is released. That means that conversation doesn't end when one PMA is done. It means that we all are feeling as though we can continue to contribute and feel as though the innovation, the continued health, and the continued investment into something that we can all feel excited about and take ownership of. There's going to be a lot of things on the news in the next few weeks, and then federal hiring is probably not going to be at the top of the list, and that's fine. But that means that we can continue to be excited about it below that threshold, take those innovations across administrations, and make sure that we are feeling the ownership over them and seeing the impact of them, not just today and tomorrow in a few weeks, but years into the future.
Stephanie, same to you.
You know, I think when I think about skills-based hiring and I think about what this transition might mean, I think that this is good, important work. And I think it really transcends whatever might happen in the next few months. I mean, having the right people with the right skills in federal positions to meet the mission, I think is important across the spectrum. And I don't see a scenario where this stops being important or that we stop having these conversations. So I have a lot of confidence that we're gonna continue to talk about this, and next year when we have this conversation, and we'll be talking about the success of what we accomplished.
I love it. You can tell the numbers person because they're counting on some data they can come at you with next year. I love that. We have to count on those conversations. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. I think this is such an important conversation. We do want to keep it going over at ClearanceJobs. So appreciate Phoebe Wells on my team who does all of the back and forth logistics, so I can just sit here and show up and respond to questions. So thank you so much. Thank you for Quay over at INSA and INSA for putting together questions. Again, I literally just get to show up. So there is a whole team of folks who are putting together logistics of these events, and I do very much appreciate it. Shout out to GDIT and to the Intelligence and National Security Foundation for underwriting this series. These are critical conversations. We want to keep this going. We will keep having the conversation. I feel like OMB, so you just OPM and acquisitions now have to respond to my next webinar request. We're going to get them on the line to do the next call because we got quite a few questions going on for them. But appreciate your efforts in this. Again, I know OMB is often the person behind the magic curtain there, making things happen and working across these agencies, but we do appreciate that work. We are excited to see what comes next. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on today's webinar.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
This is great.